platform before, but I assume that if I hit share, it will share my screen and I can begin showing some slides. So I have around 35, 36 slides for my talk, and hope to have some time at the end for Q&A. So look forward to hearing your responses and any questions or thoughts that you might have toward the end of my presentation. So let me try to do that now. Hmm. Is it correct that I simply hit share?
So,
Okay, it's asking me to open system grant access in system preferences. Not quite sure what that means. Maybe related to privacy. It's not allowing me simply to open.
Scott, would you want to email it to one of us so that they can share it as you talk?
I can try that, although I didn't shrink it, so it might be a little bit large to send by email.
Okay.
This is weird. Well, I haven't used this platform before, as I said. So. Does anyone know what I should do if I'm being sent to my preferences?
Scott, just hold on. I'll try to get the tech team to help.
sir, can you try sharing it once again? I've given you the presenter access.
Okay. Yeah, I see that you gave me that access, but it tells me to open system preferences. And then it's not allowing me to designate Cisco WebEx meetings. Just a second. Let me see if I can.
Scott, I mean, the tech team will join in a couple of minutes. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can figure out how to shrink this and send it by email. In May of 2021 at a university in Turkey, and all of the audience members, of course, were wearing masks throughout the lecture, and they were in a large auditorium spread out in various, separate, multiple chairs separate from each other in order to avoid contagion. And so in the context of humanities scholarship within the pandemic, often we think that the danger of infecting ourselves with viruses is what we need to be concerned about. I'm interested in the talk that I'm about to give you in the way we might infect people with ideas. Next slide, please. So if you had a chance to look at the abstract for my lecture, you'll see that I'm asking a very basic question about a prominent example of climate fiction by the American writer Paolo Bacigalupi, who published The Water Knife in the year 2015. And other scholars have asked whether this work inspires greater appreciation of the true value of water resources as a crucial resource during the time of global climate change and the extreme danger that many regions of the earth experience as water resources become imperiled and vanish and cause extreme pressure on human populations and other species. So I'm wondering whether this work, it seems like a simple and obvious question to ask. And eventually in my talk, I'll get to a specific focus on the water knife, but I want to build up to that first by talking a little bit about narrative contagion and a certain methodology in the environmental humanities that we call empirical ecocriticism. Next slide. Next slide, please. So in recent years, literary scholars have begun, previous slide, please. One slide back, please. Thank you. Doing empirical studies, actually gathering data on the impacts of particular narratives on audiences in the field of environmental literary studies or ecocriticism. We call this empirical ecocriticism. And one of the primary introductions to the field was published in the journal ISLE in spring 2020, when we offered a special cluster. This happened to be the final issue that I supervised as the general editor of the journal. The issue was, or the cluster was coordinated by three of the main scholars in the field: Matthew Schneider-Mayerson, who's an American scholar working in Singapore at Yale National University of Singapore; Alexa Weik von Mossner from Klagenfurt University in Austria; and Wojciech Malecki from Wrocław University in Poland. And basically, empirical ecocriticism means using empirical or data gathering approaches that combine social scientific and humanistic methodologies to ground, refine, and test common claims about influence and impact, such as responses to the question I asked earlier regarding Bacigalupi's The Water Knife. What is the effect? Does it influence people to think about the extreme value of water and how we need to be very careful with our lifestyles in order to not squander the availability of water to support human life and other species? Empirical approaches to studying literature include conducting interviews, written interviews or face-to-face interviews, using focus groups, creating survey instruments, and in various ways getting access to particular groups of experimental subjects, or sometimes doing controlled experiments with human subjects. And there are many different varieties of this, but it all involves gathering data rather than simply relying on our own individual response to artistic texts, which is the traditional approach to literary research. Next slide, please. In addition to that special cluster of articles in ISLE, there's a website that offers a very good basic introduction to the field, www.empiricalecocriticism.com. This is coordinated by Alexa Weik von Mossner through her university in Austria. And if you're curious about this approach, after you hear me talk about it a little bit, you can go to this website and gather a lot of additional information. Next slide. including a list of publications, most of which are available in full text versions. So you can really quickly see the kinds of empirical studies that have been accumulating in the past few years. Next slide. And I wanted to point out, because I realize this is a conference run primarily by graduate students, and most of the attendees, I assume, are graduate students, I wanted to let you know that the website also, in a new story from 2 months ago, profiles recent graduate theses done at universities in Hungary and Sweden that use empirical approaches. One of them is on crisis, disaster, and dystopia in environmentalist narratives, and the other one is a reader response approach to a particular story called Zoo Going, and basically a reception study using some empirical methods. So there is a precedent for graduate students using some of these empirical approaches for their work as masters and PhD students. Next slide. So I've been trying to develop some empirical approaches in my own research in the past few years, and I'm going to talk about a few examples of this in my lecture today. One of them is for a large project with groups of researchers in multiple countries. It's coordinated by the scholar I mentioned earlier, Wojciech Malecki from Poland. I'm part of the American team based here in Eugene, Oregon, where I am right now. The larger project is titled Bad Time Stories, which is a bad pun on bedtime stories. And the focus of the project is how narratives help us understand, combat, cope with, and learn from pandemics. And I'm interested in trying to understand how specifically the psychology of precarity or vulnerability is represented in artistic works, in literary works, and how these texts might affect the way readers feel precarity in their own lives, and potentially transfer the feeling of precarity to other experiential contexts. For instance, from the context of a pandemic to the context of global climate change. How might we look at a pandemic narrative and begin to feel the vulnerability of our own lives, and then carry that feeling with us into another experience, another situation. Next slide. So I've been interested in precarity for the past few years, ever since I started reading Pramod Nayar's works on the field, starting with Bhopal's Ecological Gothic, Disaster, Precarity, and the Biopolitical Uncanny, which he published in 2017, where he expresses the idea that precariousness is the effect of an exposure to the world which causes injury, which I think is a very succinct and helpful way of understanding precarity. So I'm interested in both pandemic literature and climate literature that might inspire positive or pro-social concerns among readers. And one of these positive states of mind, I would say, is the condition of precarity, rather than feeling invulnerable and indifferent to various situations in the world, ranging from the public health catastrophe of the COVID pandemic to global climate change. And if we think about these phenomena from the perspective of precarity, that's a good thing. So precarity, the feeling of precarity, is not something to avoid, as far as I'm concerned. The feeling of precarity is a pro-social or a positive state of mind, because it may make us more mindful in thinking about these larger issues. Next slide. And then Nayar began by writing about precarity in a particularly human context, and the precarity of our human lives in relation to some of our industrial behaviors, such as the use of dangerous chemicals for industrial purposes. And then he expanded his idea in a second book published in 2019, referring to eco-precarity and reflecting not only on human lives, but more broadly on all kinds of vulnerable lives as represented in literature and culture, including, as he articulates in the passage here on the screen, the potential precarity of the entire planet, or as he puts it, the contingent nature, the vulnerable, uncertain nature of the Earth itself. So I'm wondering whether Nayar's writing about human and planetary precarity might help us to appreciate the discourse of vulnerability, and that is something that we find in a novel like The Water Knife, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Next slide. So my specific project for the Bad Times Stories study actually does use the psychological concepts of emotional contagion and mortality salience. Emotional contagion has to do with literally the infectiousness of feeling. In various types of social contexts, we gauge the feeling of the atmosphere that we're in and become infected by the feelings, the emotions in that social context. And psychologists who study emotional contagion have also argued that such contagion can occur through textual encounters. I'll give you a citation of such a study in a few minutes, but I'm trying to make this relevant to the larger theme of contagion for this conference. And specifically, I'm interested in the way emotions can be spread through the sharing of texts. And in particular, I'm thinking of literary texts. And then also the particular power of stories that are relevant to mortality. And other psychologists, and here's a reference to another example, have determined that when mortality or the actuality or probability of death is relevant to the story, there's a particular power to the narrative. And a lot of pandemic narratives and climate narratives do involve mortality in one way or another, which I think has the potential to make these narratives especially salient or poignant for audiences. So I'm working with this young communication studies scholar named David Markowitz. He's a professor of communication at the University of Oregon, and he does a lot of empirical work on textual impacts. And he's created a writing prompt that asks experimental subjects to imagine what the world would look like after COVID-19 ends, if it ever ends, or if the impacts reduce in a certain way. Can we imagine what our lives will be like in this brave new world? And this is the type of prompt that we might use. We're still waiting to hear about funding for Bad Time Stories, but we're likely to expose readers to a particular pandemic text and then ask them to reflect on what the world might be like as COVID eases after they've been infected by the text, so to speak. Next slide. So as you hear me talking about narrative contagion, you might, if you know a little bit about narratology, you might find yourselves thinking about narrative empathy, which is the term developed by narratologist Suzanne Keen, particularly in her 2010 book, Empathy and the Novel. And Keen and other scholars like Lisa Sunshine are especially interested in what they call mirror neurons, which is the idea that literally our brains begin to mirror the text that we encounter, and thus we feel empathy for fictional characters. So it's related, I think, to narrative contagion or narrative infection, that we might be stimulated to feel this mirroring of empathy with characters that we encounter in a text. Keen was particularly focused on human characters and how they might inspire a feeling of deep empathy. But other scholars have since articulated the possibility of empathy for non-human characters. And there are scholars who call themselves eco-narratologists and especially focus on this kind of more than human empathy as a result of exposure to narratives. Next slide. Another closely related field is called affective ecocriticism. And just in the past few years, scholars have begun to write about affect, which is a broader, more encompassing term to describe varieties of feeling. And the way they're interested in the way in various types of textual experiences affect our emotive experience. And one such example in my particular field of ecocriticism is the 2018 collection, Affective Ecocriticism, Emotion, Embodiment, Environment, in which the editors at one point in the introduction refer to the preponderance of new and often bad affects, negative feelings emerging or being redefined in this historical epoch called the Anthropocene, including despair, resignation, climate grief, solastalgia, and familiar feelings like disappointment and anxiety, which have become particularly acute during our current historical era. And I'm especially interested, as I said earlier, in the feeling of precarity as a kind of affect. But some people might imagine precarity to be a negative affect or a bad affect. As I said earlier, I view precarity as potentially a positive pro-social affect because it may help us to think more carefully, more mindfully, and cautiously about our own lifestyles and the way our societies operate during this time of extreme vulnerability. Next slide. So the work that I'm doing with David Markowitz particularly uses a novel by American fiction writer Peter Heller, who published this work, The Dog Stars. It's a pandemic novel in the year 2011. And I'm wondering how reading a pandemic-related prompt might change people's sense of personal vulnerability. Again, this is a study that David and I haven't yet conducted. We've simply begun to design it, and now we're waiting to see whether we have the funding that will enable us to reach out to experimental subjects and begin to collect data. But what I'd like to do is expose readers or subjects to passages like this one, which is where the narrator of the novel is remembering his wife who died during the pandemic. It was a flu pandemic that occurred fictionally in this novel, and most people were killed. And in this case, his wife is extremely sick. She's barely alive anymore, and she's actually asking him to suffocate her and put her out of her misery. It's a terrible passage about vulnerability, precarity, and mortality. And thus, I think it might be particularly salient for readers to expose them to this and then to see how this makes them feel about their own precarity. Next slide. Next slide, please. So again, I said I'm interested in the way emotions might spread from a text to an audience. And psychologists refer to this as emotional contagion. Much of the work in this field has been about social networks and people reaching out and spreading feelings, through social media. But other kinds of texts might also have the potential to spread emotions. So I'd like to build on this work in studying narrative contagion. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Uma Devi, are you there? Yeah.
Sir, one second. I think it's stuck once again.
Also, just to mention again this idea of mortality salience, that when we realize that when the text pertains to mortality and we begin to think about our own mortality, I think there's the potential for particular mindfulness and especially meaningful communication of emotion. Next slide. And then one of my interests also is the idea that, I mean, I'm thinking of Guha and Martinez Alier's famous distinction between environmentalism of the North and environmentalism of the global South, the full stomach, contented form of environmentalism versus the empty belly struggle to survive in the environmentalism of the South. And what I would really like to see is whether certain types of exposure to texts might lead to a salutary or healthy sense of precarity, or in other words, a new mindfulness for readers who otherwise are not inclined to feel precarious. In other words, people who experience full stomach environmentalism might actually be shifted into the empty belly category and have a deeper and healthy sense of their own precarity. Next slide. So now let's move quickly from pandemic literature to cli-fi. Bacigalupi's book is typically thought of as an example of cli-fi or climate fiction, but the founder of climate fiction, an American journalist and blogger whose name is Dan Bloom. Many of you probably are familiar with cli-fi, but you may not actually know that Bloom is the one who coined this phrase in 2008. But he wrote to me recently, just in December, and said that he's decided to stop promoting and advocating for the cli-fi literary genre. Instead, he says his new work will center on what he calls end times fiction, or ETF, focusing on how to accept our fate as climate change impact events cause mass human extinction. He says, I'm no longer interested in cli-fi. Now I'm on the ETF literary path. So I may occasionally refer to The Water Knife by Bacigalupi as cli-fi, but I think it's so dystopian and so extreme in the dire picture of the future state of the world and the state of humanity that this novel actually would fit very well into the ETF category as well. Next slide. So I read this 2015 cli-fi novel or ETF novel, The Water Knife, as a study in extreme precarity. I don't know how many of you have read The Water Knife or have heard of or are familiar with other works by Paolo Bacigalupi, but from the very opening scene of The Water Knife, Water Knife is someone who targets particular bodies of water and tries to um, uh, limit access that other people have to them, and kind of carve out the water resources for the people that he works for. He's sort of a hitman focusing on water resources. And one of the main characters in the novel is named Angel Velasquez, and he's meeting with a lawyer in the opening scene. We don't know anything about them. All we know is they're thinking about killing and eating each other from the very beginning scene, these two characters. It's not a normal business meeting, but it's a meeting of where violence is on the table, and we learn that one of the characters has gang tattoos. This is just a picture showing some gang tattoos that make him seem monstrous and dangerous. So from the very opening scene, we realize that we're in this realm of extreme precarity. Next slide. As I read the novel, I had the strong feeling that Bacigalupi had created a Hobbesian imaginary, basically bringing to narrative life Thomas Hobbes' very famous description of human life from Leviathan from the mid-17th century, where he famously said the life of a man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And the lives of the characters in Bacigalupi's novel are nasty, brutish, and in many cases short, because they're constantly imperiled and in danger of, even their friends turning on them in order to kind of scrap and claw for survival. Next slide. Not only is the novel Hobbesian, but it's Malthusian. That literally brings Malthus's famous theories about what would happen eventually as human population increased, brings them to life. And Malthus, those of you who've read his essay on the principle of population, will remember that he believes that human population growth will eventually outrun available resources, and only starvation, war, and disease will keep human population in check. And so we have basically starvation or thirst, and war or violent conflict in the context of Bacigalupi's novel. But this seems to be a particularly powerful time to be reading novels like this, because not only are we in the midst of a very ominous war that is beginning and could very well envelop many of our other countries around the world, but also, of course, the pandemic is not finished, and we're experiencing disease, which is most scholars would argue related to our interactions with other species, and basically too many people to feed, too much spread of our interactions with other animals, and thus we come into contact with viruses that spill over into human populations. So we're living during a Malthusian era, and it's a very powerful time to be reading a novel like Bacigalupi's The Water Knife. Next slide. Next slide, please. So early in the novel, we learn that the precarity is not just people thinking or acting violently toward each other, but the precarity of the characters has everything to do with water or its absence. This is a particular scene where on Hell, the water knife, whose job is to go out and hunt for communities that have access to water and basically steal the water from them. And he's dreaming of an earlier era where there was abundant water, and reminiscing nostalgically about that, and missing that in his own hyper precarious near future life. Next slide. So Bacigalupi is portraying a dystopian near future that illustrates the precarity of present day society. And this is, I think, a representation of the not too distant future of the American Southwest, in particular, places like Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada, Los Angeles, California, but imagining how other cities in North America have experienced extreme precarity or have simply disappeared as a result of insufficient water resources. And although this is a North American novel, I think in some ways it could easily be applied to readers or feel relevant for readers in other societies like India, where, of course, there are many extremely arid regions. And so it's illustrating the precarity of the present day by creating a dystopian near future. Next slide. Bacigalupi's novel actually clearly, explicitly echoes a famous book of popular journalism by Marc Reisner called Cadillac Desert. And there are numerous references to Reisner's book in the novel, in Bacigalupi's novel. The characters often carry Reisner's book from 1986, republished in a new edition in 1993, but often the characters will have Cadillac Desert in their homes, or they'll give it to other characters. And at one point they refer here, and I have the quotation here, to Reisner's Cadillac Desert as the Bible when it comes to water. And basically Reisner is saying eventually human population in arid regions will develop such a need for water that the water resources will be insufficient, and there will be extreme social conflict in pursuit, a desperate pursuit of water needed for survival. So the fact that there are these explicit references to a nonfiction book emphasizes that this is not merely a fanciful novel, but it's a novel about actual reality in a particular part of the world. Next slide. The water knife also, in some ways, echoes the cautious optimism of a very famous work of nonfiction by Jared Diamond on why write about collapsing societies. And Diamond says near the very end of his huge book that he's writing about the way societies fail for various reasons because he's a cautious optimist. And I think in a way, Bacigalupi may be a cautious optimist. He may be creating this dystopian narrative because he wants to infect us with a feeling of precarity so that we'll change our ways, change our lives, and change our societies, and maybe evade this experience of collapse. Next slide. Next slide, please. So we learn toward the end of Bacigalupi's novel that the characters are deeply interested in survival. Someone will always survive. So there's a semi-hopeful takeaway that it's not all is not hopeless, and that we might, if we're mindful, if we take to heart this feeling of precarity, we might actually find a way to survive. And a few of the characters at the end of the novel do seem likely to survive. Next slide. Could I have the next slide? Yeah, again, this basically repeats what I just said with another example, that our precarious reality today may result from our wasteful, careless contemporary attitude toward water resources, and one could certainly mention other resources such as petroleum, and our rampant, reckless use of these resources has created our current reality. But we may just manage to evade the future that Bacigalupi describes in his fiction. Next slide. Next slide, please. And so I'm wondering, and I'm pretty close to the end here, whether the pro-social message in The Water Knife is contagious or whether other anti-social messages dominate. And it seems to me that, because of my angle in reading the book and the fact of the kind of work that I do, that this novel, The Water Knife, makes a pretty strong case for the fact that we should be more careful with our use of water, recognize the preciousness of water. Next slide. But there are other sub-themes in the novel, like the fact that the characters are mercurial, they're constantly changing, and they're shifting their loyalties and flipping on each other, is the term that they use, where they're unreliable and they're combative toward each other. Next slide. At the very end, one of the characters, who's a journalist, betrays the water knife and refuses to hand over some key legal papers that would give river water rights to the water knife, which is what he's pursuing. So basically, she flips on him and decides that she's not going to hand over these paper granting water rights. Next slide. And at the very end, another one of the characters shows up and shoots one of the key characters with a gun, and they're constantly shifting loyalties, and unreliability are strongly evident in these relationships, and which don't really seem to support the pro-social notion of characters coming together with a common vision of how to use water more carefully and create a more sustainable society. Next slide. So one of the key practitioners of empirical ecocriticism, whom I mentioned earlier, is Matthew Schneider-Mayerson, who works at the Yale National University of Singapore campus. And he, in that special cluster of articles that I mentioned in the journal ISLE, he actually wrote a paper about the water knife specifically. And he says that a lot of people took away strongly negative emotional responses to the water knife in his study, even if they appreciated the book and found it valuable. What they appreciated was the fact that the book seemed to have a strong relationship to real world water issues and a world in which climate change is accelerating and a catastrophic future seems likely. So they valued the fact that the book so closely mirrored the historical reality in this region of the world, as I suggested earlier when talking about how the book explicitly refers to this famous work of journalism called Cadillac Desert. Next slide. And Schneider-Mayerson says that the author, Bacigalupi, highlights the arbitrariness and unfairness of climate injustice and xenophobia. And he, in various interviews after the novel appeared, the author made clear that he was attempting to represent the realities of unjust access to water resources. And this was one of his primary goals in writing the novel. This is a pro-social message that the novelist had in mind. Next slide. But in his article, Schneider-Mayerson says that readers, through his empirical study, he found that readers take mixed messages from the novel. And some of the readers do gain a kind of heightened awareness of climate justice and identify with climate migrants, people who are forced to move, to migrate as a result of not having enough water where they're currently living. So in the top paragraph here, Schneider-Mayerson says, do these results suggest that the water knife is an unmitigated success as a vehicle of creative climate communication? In other words, does it infect readers with this strong feeling of awareness of climate justice and sympathy for people who are suffering from climate injustice? He says, not so fast. Only 1 out of 5 readers reported that one of the messages they took away from the water knife was about climate change, while many reviewers or critics read the water knife as a blunt message about the threat of climate change. A minority of readers in his empirical study agreed. The lesson here is somewhat obvious, but important nonetheless. It may be more difficult to predict the lesson or message that readers will take away from a work of fiction than many scholars assume. Next slide. In particular, what Schneider-Mayerson found is that conservative antisocial perspectives on human nature are foregrounded in the novel and very strongly influenced many of the non-professional readers of the novel. Nearly 1 out of 5 readers reported that one lesson concerned human nature, claims about the way that people really are. The water knife portrayed a world in which a conservative perspective on human nature, such as self-interested pursuit of individualistic goals, has become dominant. Since this is the way the world works, it justifies the decisions by all actors to behave accordingly. And so at the very end, where one of the characters shoots another one, the final turn or flipping on another character affirms this central refrain in the book, that starry-eyed do-gooders with pro-social visions who do not acknowledge basic truths about the world will pay the price. Next slide. So this idea of kind of studying the psychology of precarity and developing pro-social attitudes or antisocial attitudes as a result of exposure to certain kinds of texts is related to work I've been doing for many years on the convergence between empirical psychological studies and literary studies. This is, a few of you might be familiar with this book that I did called Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, which then has evolved into a website called arithmeticofcompassion.org that explores the textual representation of information about humanitarian and environmental crises. Next slide. So I do a lot of this work with my father, who's a psychologist. And so one of the ways that I get access to other social scientists who are knowledgeable about empirical methods is, through the professional networks of my father, or sometimes I've done research with my father where we design studies together with him offering the psychological and empirical perspective, and with me coming up with the texts that we use in our research and then helping to interpret the audience's responses to these texts. Next slide. And so this is the end. My guiding question here, I know I've given a number of kind of overarching questions, but on a larger scale, I'm interested in whether we can use certain concepts and empirical methods from psychology, such as emotional contagion and mortality salience, and from the environmental humanities, such as the concepts of precarity, apprehension, the way we grasp or fail to grasp ideas, and also non-exceptionalism, meaning that we are not exceptional to the feeling of precarity. It's not just other people or other organisms that are precarious, but we ourselves are susceptible to precarity. And we can use these ideas to understand how certain narratives might spur or encourage a healthy sense of mindfulness and urgent caution in readers or experimental subjects, and help people become more sensitive to difficult to perceive and difficult to understand processes occurring in the world, such as desertification, the loss of water resources, climate change more generally, and various other phenomena, including pandemic diseases. So I hope my talk felt relevant to you, to the subject of contagion. I tried to take some of the ideas that I've been working on in various recent studies and shift them slightly to be somewhat more explicitly relevant to the theme of the conference, contagion. And I know we got a slightly late start for technical difficulties, but I hope we have a couple minutes for some comments or questions. Thanks very much. Maybe we can unshare the screen. Thank you
for that enriching session. We will now be moving into the Q&A session. Please remember to keep your questions straightforward and pointed. Each participant will be allowed one question. The speaker and the members of the organizing committee can choose to disallow any questions under their discretion. We now open the floor for questions. Please raise hands and the members of our team will recognize you.
Sanchar, you can go ahead with your question.
Hello, Professor Solvic. It was a great, it was really enriching as a lecture, because I have been working on science fiction quite for the last 2-3 years, and it was a really insightful, perspective that you have, allowed me to look into. Sir, I would keep my question quite brief. My question is end times fiction. Would you please like to comment on the fact that, do you think the aspect of precarity, which we are trying to look into through the climate change narratives, is it always very quintessentially science fictional? Like, I just want to link it with the fact that whether end times fictional narratives, the corpus of the narratives which are there within this end times fiction banner, are they very quintessentially science fiction? And if so, is science fiction the only most powerful mode, can be considered as the most powerful mode of narratives that talk about climate change in the contemporary scenario of the Anthropocene? That's my question, sir.
Yeah, well, so Sanchar, are you familiar with Bacigalupi's The Water Knife?
Yes, sir. I have read the novel.
Would you consider it science fiction or speculative fiction?
I would consider it speculative fiction, but I still feel that to some extent, since they're talking about a lot of novel aspects about, how civilization is transforming and all, so they have some basic traits of science fictional, conceptualizations which are also there. So, but yeah, I would agree with your point that it's predominantly a speculative fiction.
Yeah, I think it's well, it's future oriented, right? He's describing a near future. It's recognizable, not a distant future on another planet or in a some kind of spacecraft or something that it would be less familiar to ordinary readers today. So it's in the near future. It's speculating about what might happen in the near future. There are, as you say, I think you're right. There are certain small technologies that are, that special buildings that privileged people live in, that could be considered kind of a new technology, and that would push parts of the novel into science fiction. But I would say that the I do think this special sense of precarity, that is intended to comment on our current lives and our current societies, it does operate particularly well when projected into these speculations, fictional speculations about the future. So again, I'm not sure whether this would be strictly science fiction as a genre or speculative fiction or other types of near futures that are represented. Peter Heller's novel is a kind of alternate reality. I'm not sure I would call the Dog Stars science fiction exactly, except that it includes a disease, and so there's a sort of a medical component to it. But it seems as if he's describing the present day, or something slightly in the future that hasn't happened yet but could happen. One aspect of the novel that I really highlighted in my talk, the novel The Water Knife, is how closely it mirrors recognizable features of our reality, certainly the reality of the American West or Southwest, but maybe even for readers in other parts of the world in particularly arid or dry, conditions. Reading The Water Knife will cause a kind of a feeling of recognition that this is the way life is today, and if just pushed slightly further in an extreme and negative way, then life could become much more difficult. And so it's interesting. There's this future-oriented or speculative aspect of Bacigalupi's novel, but also a strong reflection of lived experience for the readers. And that seems to be especially important in imparting this message of precarity. I don't know if I've answered your question very well, Sanchar, but this is what occurs to me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Varna, you
Varna,
can go ahead.
thank you.
Uh, Hello, Professor. It was a very insightful lecture. So, adding on to my question is something which kind of takes a related but different trajectory. So, you have talked about how the concept of emotional contagion can be useful in thinking about apocalyptic possibilities that rises to our mind when you think about climate change. I was wondering to what extent could an affective engagement with the text or the idea of emotional contagion be informative in thinking about the precarity experienced by species other than humans. So my work is centered around phytocriticism, which you know, talking about the subjectivity of plants and thinking about say the futures of existence of a species other than humans. So when we think about this particular aspect, considering that thinking about and writing about non-humans has been one of the foundational premise of ecocritical scholarship, would you think that narrative empathy or emotional engagement with the text can prompt readers, other than people who engage in scholarly spheres, to think more actively about non-human beings like animals or plants, or especially like plants or fungi, which are fundamentally so different from us, but still so so important for our survival? Or would that qualify as some sort of sentimentalization of anthropomorphism, which again sort of shift the narrative focus back to us? So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you, Varna. That's a great question. And that's, I think, a really important question in the field of eco-criticism. I mentioned very briefly during my talk the field of eco-narratology. And I think that's a term coined by my colleague from the University of Idaho, Erin James, who wrote a book called The Story World Accord. And she has a new book coming out, a Narrative in the Anthropocene. And I think she highlights this issue, especially in the new book that's just forthcoming this spring, Narrative in the Anthropocene, of trans-species empathy as inspired by narrative or as represented by different types of narratives. I think she has a chapter on plant narratives in the book and things like that. So it's definitely a study that you would want to look at. Actually, just recently, I was reading an article by a PhD student from McGill University in Canada, she is a creative writer and an anthropology doctoral student, especially interested in trans species empathy, which I think is related to what you're talking about, and whether narrative might somehow promote or encourage this empathy for other species. This is the kind of thing that eco-narratologists study, but this particular student, whose name is Amy Donovan, Donovan, has written a beautiful article about trans-species empathy and whales. It was published in a book called Cold Water Oil. It's a new book just published a few months ago, Cold Water Oil, Offshore Petroleum Cultures. It's in the Routledge Environmental Humanities series, and Amy Donovan's chapter, which is called Raw, Dense, and Loud, A Whale's Perspective on Cold Water Energy, is a really profound and creatively written work of scholarship and creative writing together that begins with a narrative section imagining the sensibility of a whale in a kind of a vivid narrative form. And I think in a lot of ways, this particular article does a good job of spurring a feeling of empathy for another type of mammal who lives has a very different ontology and epistemology than humans, because whales live in the ocean, obviously. So it's difficult for us to understand the way a whale experiences the world. But the text, I think, does a good job of suggesting the potential for at least a certain degree of empathy with the whale. A whale, obviously, though, is much more similar to us than other species, plant species, or just a wide range of other living organisms that are other than human. And so this is a very much an open question that a lot of humanities scholars are exploring. It's been a subject of philosophical study. People trying to imagine what it is to experience the world as a bat, for instance, and trying to understand whether trees should have legal standing because of some intrinsic philosophical quality that they have. I think narratologists are interested in questions like what you're asking, whether narrative in particular might enable us to achieve a kind of empathetic attachment with lives that are very different than our own. I would also maybe point to the larger field of material ecocriticism, which in a strange way is also relevant in suggesting that material phenomena, even inorganic phenomena, have stories embedded in them, that there's a kind of narrative energy or a vibrancy, as Jane Bennett would put it, even in non-organic, inorganic phenomena. And so that perhaps we should be attempting to empathize with physical phenomena that don't seem to be alive. So going beyond simply empathizing with plants or insects or animals that live in water, maybe we should be seeking empathy with other phenomena that are even more alien to ourselves. But your question is a really good one, and it's a lively and open area for research right now by quite a few scholars. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful.
So I'm wondering whether others who are attending right now, or when you're thinking of the topic of contagion and the humanities, are especially interested in the pandemic context, because that's probably why the subject of contagion rose prominently as you're thinking of a theme for the conference, and whether some of you are reading pandemic literature these days. I've certainly been reading quite a few novels. I'd never really thought specifically of pandemic literature. I think I was aware of Camus' The Plague years ago, but didn't think there was an entire body of literature, a genre that we might refer to as pandemic literature. But have become vividly aware of that in recent years, and I wonder whether you've read any interesting pandemic literature that might be relevant to the conference theme of contagion, and whether any of you are working on this subject.
Um, may I go for a second question? Is
Yeah, sure.
possible?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, thanks.
Voice is not audible, Sanchar.
This
Not at all.
Scott, actually, last few months, audible right now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, Professor Solvic, I wanted to mention that I think in the last few months, I have taken an active interest in reading the Bacigalupian texts. So, since the major part of your lecture was based on the water knife, I think that his texts.
We just lost your sound, Sanchar.
For this irregularities in the network. I think that all these texts by Bacigalupi are very instrumental in the study of pandemic literature right now. And the other thing I think which is very interesting to note is that while the water knife is very North American in its setting, the other novel, right, The Wind-Up Girl, is also very, it spans over the world. So it's not very localized or, particularly set in a specific continent. So him
I'm afraid your voice is cutting out something.
I apologize for the irregularity in the network, sir, but I hope I'm audible right now.
Yes, at the moment, yes.
Yeah. So I think that the fact that his narratives are also spanning over the world in various other settings shows that like how he's using this speculative fiction as well as certain science fictional traits in his narrative to show that how pandemic literature and kind of combining it with the climate change characteristics which are very dominant. So he comes out as a very, very dominant author, I think, through a mode of popular narrative, which is taking us to the real scenarios of climate change. So I think that these writers like him are actually very significant in today's, literary horizon, actually. So
Yeah.
that's what I thought of sharing with
you.
you.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Yeah, no, Bacigalupi is a very interesting writer. I've taught The Wind-Up Girl in the past as well, his earlier novel, which focuses not on water specifically, but on energy. And in the Water Knife is about this urgent quest for water resources in dry places, and the Wind-Up Girl focuses on the desperate need for calories or energy, and people are prospecting for calories in different ways all around the world. And of course, energy, I mean, you might argue that water and energy are deeply bound up together. In fact, this book that I mentioned, which came out in one of the book series that I edit recently, edited by two professors from Newfoundland, Canada, focusing on cold water energy prospecting in the North Seas. And that's why the final beautiful article by Amy Donovan is about the effect of energy prospecting in the ocean upon whales, and how detrimental it is to their survival. So water and energy are bound up together in that scholarly collection, Cold Water Oil, as well. But I agree with you that Bacigalupi is a very interesting and significant writer. But for me, just as the takeaway from my talk is that the intentional contagion of ideas that authors may attempt to produce through their fictional narratives is not as straightforward as we may think. That's, as Matthew Schneider-Mayerson says in his essay about the water knife, we may think that a climate change message is being presented very vividly and compellingly, but slow down, not so fast. That message may actually not be getting through to many of the people who simply read the novel for entertainment. They're looking for a kind of exciting, thrilling novel about characters doing dramatic things. And in fact, there is a lot of violent drama and desperate struggle to survive in that novel. And yet the takeaways that readers are receiving may not be the positive messages that the author is attempting to convey. This, as he said, this may be obvious to most people that fiction is complex. Literature in general. The same is true, of course, of poetry, and particularly elegant and artful nonfiction also may not just be entirely transparent, but may have rather complex, multi-layered meanings. And so the function of this new branch of literary studies that is hybridized and interdisciplinary, using social science methodologies to study and help interpret literary texts and other kinds of artistic texts, that the goal is actually to refine our understanding of the way messages are conveyed, ideas and feelings are contagious or not contagious from text to audience. And so again, this may be a kind of a metaphorical use of the idea of contagion, even though I'm writing or speaking a little bit about pandemic literature, but I hope it seems relevant in certain ways to the larger themes of this conference. I wanted to, because there don't seem to be a huge number of questions, wanted to recommend this novel by Geraldine Brooks called Year of Wonders. If you're looking for pandemic literature, I think it came out around 2001, but a very beautiful novel about a 17th century plague in a village in the UK or in Great Britain at the time, and the way, even in the midst of a terrible plague, the characters are finding certain aspects of their lives to celebrate, things that are beautiful, relationships, and other aspects of life to appreciate, even during a devastating public health experience. So I think it's a very beautiful example of pandemic literature. And another novel, I don't know that it's quite as eloquent as A Year of Wonders, but Lawrence Wright's The End of October is kind of interesting. Published, it was in press when the current pandemic began. So an unusual kind of prescience on the part of this writer, who's a New Yorker magazine writer, journalist, and wrote this novel about the threat of a global pandemic that could truly devastate the human population. Anyway, it's quite a readable and interesting book. Also, one of the books that I've read while living through this pandemic. I don't know. To me, it's uncanny to be watching through the media the war that's breaking out in Ukraine right now, after a few years of feeling this unusual sense of precarity because of the pandemic, just as we're starting to not wear our masks all the time and feel a little bit more free to interact with other people. A new experience is occurring that I don't know how it makes you feel and whether you're following it in the media, but I feel this a sense of precarity as a result of the war in Ukraine that is emotionally similar to the precarity that I remember experiencing, during the peak of the current pandemic, and the sense of vulnerability, the sense that none of us is immune, that the war is currently confined to Russia and Ukraine, but many of our countries could be swept up in it somehow. It really has planetary geopolitical implications. And I'm still trying to get my head around the way the precarity of the pandemic may be relevant to the geopolitical situation that we're all living through right now, even if we're in North America or India. I think this battle that is occurring, that involves a nuclear power, and many other countries around the world are being compelled to take sides, and I think there's much reason to worry about our collective vulnerability at this time. So, the what's in the news today, I think, is directly relevant to the subjects that I was trying to speak about in my lecture. So thank you very much for inviting me to join your conference and to share some ideas with you and hear some thoughts from all of you. And I don't know that we have much more time, but I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Pleasure having you.
Thank you, Swarna. So are we kind of at the end of our session? Oh, you're muted, Swarna.
Yeah, Lakshmi, have we reached the end of the section?
Yes, sir. If you would like to conclude with the Q&A, then we will be at the end of the session.
I don't think there are any more questions, Lakshmi. Maybe you could just ask for the last time.
Yes. So if there are any other questions, we request members and audiences to raise their hands. If not, we may proceed. Okay, I'm assuming nobody has any further questions. So that will be all. A very heartfelt thank you to Professor Scott Solvic for his gracious presence and that very insightful talk. We at the conference team.
Yeah,
Yes,
and if I can just make a small, I know, digression. It's not a digression, it's an important thing. I think Professor Scott is facing precarity in his personal situation. His mom is not well at all. And in spite of that, I think he was very gracious, and he was with us today. I mean, I think he's taken out precious time from his personal caregiving duties, and we are very deeply appreciative of that, Scott, and thank you so much. And please take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Our best wishes.
Thank you. Thank you.
We at the conference team are extremely grateful. We will begin with the first panel for this morning, Contagion and Gender Identities, moderated by Professor Vinita V. Thampi at 10:45 a.m. We request everyone to stay with us in the meantime.